So one of the things that I learned and I thought was really interesting about cities and Dutch culture while we were over there is I learned how they can be affected from the ground up through historical context and all that, and not just in like the design of the city and the construction and the city planning and all of that, but in the culture, in the legislation, day-to-day social interactions, and even their sort of like national design style. When we first started studying the Randstad and the Netherlands, I learned about the polder model, and I assumed going over there that we would be seeing it in in their system of government, because that's what the polder model is sort of based around, is the fact that they constantly are compromising on things and working together towards the better whole. But in some general aspect of their design as well, compromise between the old and the new school. But it's much more than I expected. It's visible in everything. A lot of the designers that we talked to, one of the themes that came up was designing frameworks, and you could one of the projects that's specifically about that was Jurgen Bay's proof or progressive office, which is like, he designs all these separate pieces for office work, and then allows people to build like their own office out of that. So it's a framework for other people to work in. So it's in obvious ways like that, or also in a more subtle way, like Bert-Jan Pot in his interview talked about, in terms of storytelling, I believe what he said exactly was give ingredients for stories, and then allow the user or the person with the object to sort of create their own stories out of it. And where I see the designing frameworks coming from, I think it might have something to do with like a lot of what Dutch culture is this going back to the polder model, is this intense regulation and control and all of that, because the land is tightly regulated and organized and the government is really well organized, but there's an incredible amount of freedom around that, and people are allowed to do what they want and do good things as a result of that, and I think that's it's something that I found really interesting. The most interesting experience that I had in terms of urbanism and neighborhoods, because we spent a long time just being immersed in it and filming, and that was actually one of my favorite parts of the trip, is when we went out on our own to the Eastern Docklands. And I studied the Eastern Docklands before we left to try to sort of understand what that neighborhood was all about. And I had a lot of presuppositions about it. I assumed that because it's a really high-end, sort of expensive neighborhood, and that was sort of like built specifically for rich people, I assumed that it would be like the kinds of rich neighborhoods we have in Vancouver. But what I found when I got there was this incredibly vibrant community in which people were using their public spaces. There were people having birthday parties with their kids in the park, bouncy castles and wonderful stuff like that. And it was really interesting to see that, and it's something that I noticed in the rest of Holland as well, or in the rest of the major cities, is that the way that the streets are set up is in the same way, even if it's not necessarily in a small neighborhood. There's this really interesting gradient of public to private space that's not as super well defined as we have here, and I think that that's maybe what the difference is between that kind of a rich neighborhood and the kind that we have in Canada. It's the wide pedestrian spaces that they were using, like front yards, are public spaces. They're not their yards, and they're not fenced off with little white picket fences. And as a result, people are more respectful of that kind of a space. You don't have as much sort of tension surrounding it, and you just have people that are interacting and running into each other in a really, really natural way, which was really wonderful to see. And I in terms of considering designing working neighborhoods that work in a better way than a lot of what we have in North America, I think that that's a really fantastic model to think about. And I found it really inspirational and quite beautiful.